You're carrying something heavy right now. Maybe it's anxiety about work, or grief that hasn't finished with you yet, or anger you can't quite justify feeling. And when someone asks how you're doing, you smile and say you're fine. You've probably done this hundreds of times. Most of us have. It feels like the socially appropriate thing to do, the professional thing, the thing that keeps life moving forward without unnecessary complications. But here's what's actually happening in your brain when you do this. You're not just choosing a polite response. You're activating a specific cognitive process that has measurable, immediate effects on how your mind functions. And those effects aren't neutral. When you suppress an emotion, when you actively work to keep it out of your awareness or prevent it from showing, you're engaging what psychologists call effortful control. This isn't a passive state. It's active mental work, the kind that draws on a limited cognitive resource called executive function. Executive function is the umbrella term for the mental processes that help you plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks. It's what allows you to stay on track during a complex conversation, solve problems that require multiple steps, or resist the urge to check your phone when you're supposed to be concentrating. Daniel Wegner, a psychologist who spent much of his career studying mental control, demonstrated something surprising about trying not to think about things. In his most famous experiments, he asked people to not think about a white bear. Simple enough, except it wasn't. The instruction to suppress the thought actually made the white bear more intrusive, not less. Participants reported the forbidden thought bouncing back into consciousness repeatedly, often more than if they'd never been told to suppress it in the first place. This phenomenon, which Wegner called ironic process theory, reveals something fundamental about how suppression works, or rather, how it doesn't work. The mental system responsible for suppression actually requires two separate processes working simultaneously. One is the intentional operating process, the part of your mind actively searching for thoughts or feelings that don't involve the white bear or the anxiety or whatever you're trying to avoid. The other is the monitoring process, which runs in the background scanning for any sign of the unwanted content so it can be redirected. Here's the problem. The monitoring process is actually looking for the very thing you're trying not to think about. It has to, in order to catch it and suppress it. But this creates a paradox. The monitor keeps finding what you're trying to avoid, and each time it does, it signals the operating process to redirect your attention. This back and forth takes cognitive effort, a lot of it. And executive function isn't unlimited. Studies measuring working memory capacity, which is closely tied to executive function, show that people actively suppressing emotional content perform worse on cognitive tasks. In one study, participants who were told to hide their emotional reactions while watching a disturbing film later showed impaired memory for details they'd been asked to remember. Another line of research found that emotional suppression reduced performance on tasks requiring concentration and problem solving. The mental resources required to keep emotions hidden weren't available for other cognitive work. Think about what this means in practical terms. You're in a meeting at work, and you're upset about something that happened that morning. Maybe a conflict with a partner, maybe bad news about your health, maybe just an accumulation of small stresses that have left you feeling fragile. You decide to push it down and focus. But the very act of pushing it down is consuming the cognitive resources you need to focus. Your working memory, already occupied with tracking the conversation and formulating responses, now also has to maintain the suppression. The result is that you might miss important details, struggle to contribute meaningfully, or find yourself mentally exhausted by the end of a task that shouldn't have been that demanding. This helps explain why people often describe feeling drained after situations where they had to maintain a calm exterior while feeling turbulent inside. It's not just the emotion itself that's tiring, it's the suppression. You've been running a cognitively expensive background process the entire time. Wegner's research also revealed that the monitoring process is particularly vulnerable under certain conditions. When you're tired, stressed, or cognitively loaded, already dealing with demanding tasks, the monitoring process weakens. It can't scan as effectively. But the unwanted thoughts and feelings don't weaken. They're still there, and now. They're more likely to break through precisely when you're least equipped to deal with them. This is why suppressed emotions often surface at inconvenient times. Late at night when you're trying to sleep and your executive function is depleted. In the middle of an unrelated conversation when your cognitive resources are stretched thin. During a moment that should be pleasant, but suddenly isn't because everything you've been holding back decides to make an appearance. The irony deepens. The harder you try to suppress something, the more cognitive resources you dedicate to that suppression, the more likely it becomes that the unwanted content will intrude. You end up in a cycle where the solution intensifies the problem. There's another layer to this. The cognitive load of suppression doesn't just affect your performance on unrelated tasks. It also impairs your ability to regulate emotions going forward. Emotion regulation, the process of managing which emotions you experience, when you experience them, and how you express them, relies heavily on executive function. Effective regulation strategies like reappraisal, where you change how you think about a situation to change how you feel about it, require cognitive resources. When those resources are already depleted by suppression, your capacity for more adaptive regulation strategies diminishes. So you're left with a narrowed toolkit. The more you suppress, the less equipped you become to do anything other than suppress more. And as your regulation capacity weakens, your emotional experiences may become more intense or more difficult to manage, which creates even more pressure to suppress, which consumes even more resources. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. This isn't just theory. Functional MRI studies have identified the brain regions involved in emotional suppression. The prefrontal cortex, particularly areas associated with cognitive control, shows increased activation during suppression. Meanwhile, the amygdala, a region central to emotional processing, doesn't quiet down as much as you might expect. In some studies, sustained suppression actually correlates with maintained or even increased amygdala activity over time. You're working harder in your prefrontal cortex to control something that isn't actually getting quieter in the emotional centers of your brain. You're spending resources to maintain a lid on a pot that's still boiling. And here's what makes this particularly relevant to everyday life. Most people don't just suppress emotions occasionally. For many, it becomes a default strategy, something automatic that happens without conscious decision. You might not even register that you're doing it. But each instance adds to the cognitive load. Each time you smile through discomfort, push down irritation, or override sadness with false cheerfulness, you're running that expensive dual process system. Do it consistently throughout a day, and you've spent a substantial portion of your cognitive budget on suppression before you even get to the tasks you actually care about accomplishing. The White Bear studies were elegant in their simplicity, but their implications extend far beyond laboratory curiosities. They revealed something essential about the architecture of human thought. Trying not to think about something requires thinking about it. Trying not to feel something requires monitoring for that feeling. And the mental work of monitoring and redirecting has real costs that show up in how well you can think, decide, and function. When you tell someone you're fine and you're not just being polite. You're allocating cognitive resources to a task that may undermine your ability to actually be fine. Your heart doesn't know you're pretending. Your body doesn't get the memo that you've decided to appear calm and collected while your internal world is anything but. And this disconnect, this gap between what you're feeling and what you're allowing yourself to express, sets off a cascade of physiological responses that have nothing to do with social etiquette and everything to do with biological systems designed to respond to threat. When you experience an emotion, particularly a strong one like fear, anger, or sadness, your body prepares for action. This is the autonomic nervous system at work, the network of nerves that controls involuntary bodily functions. The sympathetic branch activates, your heart rate increases, your breathing quickens, stress hormones flood your bloodstream. This is adaptive. These responses evolved to help you deal with danger, to fight or flee or freeze when survival demanded it. But here's where suppression creates a problem. When you suppress the expression or acknowledgement of an emotion, you don't deactivate the physiological arousal that came with it. The emotion still triggered your sympathetic nervous system. Your body still mobilized resources. But now, instead of moving towards some kind of resolution, discharge, or even just acknowledgement, the arousal persists without outlet. You're physiologically activated but behaviorally constrained. Research on emotional suppression and cardiovascular function reveals this quite clearly. In studies where participants are asked to suppress their emotions while watching distressing or anger-inducing material, their blood pressure increases, not just slightly, significantly. At the same time, their heart rate may not increase as much as you'd expect for someone experiencing strong emotion, because they're also trying to control their physiological responses as part of the suppression effort. This creates an unusual pattern: elevated blood pressure without the corresponding heart rate increase that would normally accompany it. It's a stressed cardiovascular system working hard without the natural rhythm of emotional expression and recovery. James Gross, who has studied emotion regulation extensively, found that suppression consistently leads to increased sympathetic nervous system activation compared to other regulation strategies, or to simply experiencing and expressing emotion naturally. Participants who suppressed showed greater increases in measures like finger pulse amplitude and skin conductance, indicators of sympathetic arousal. Their bodies were working harder, even as their faces remained neutral. This matters because chronic sympathetic activation, without adequate recovery, is exactly what contributes to long-term health problems. Your cardiovascular system isn't designed to run hot all the time. It needs periods of parasympathetic dominance, the rest and digest state, where your heart rate slows, your blood pressure normalizes, your body repairs and replenishes. When suppression keeps your sympathetic system engaged, you compress the time available for parasympathetic recovery. Then there's cortisol. This is the hormone most people associate with stress, and for good reason. It's released by your adrenal glands in response to signals from your brain that something demanding or threatening is happening. In acute doses, cortisol is helpful. It mobilizes energy, sharpens focus, helps you respond to challenges. But cortisol is meant to spike and then return to baseline. The system is designed for intermittent activation, not continuous elevation. Emotional suppression, particularly when it becomes chronic, interferes with the normal cortisol rhythm. Studies measuring cortisol levels throughout the day in people who habitually suppress emotions have found patterns of dysregulation. Sometimes this shows up as higher overall cortisol. Sometimes it appears as a flattened diurnal rhythm, where the normal morning peak and evening decline become less pronounced, indicating that the system is failing to regulate itself properly. Elevated or dysregulated cortisol has downstream effects that ripple through multiple biological systems. It affects your immune function. Chronic cortisol exposure can suppress immune activity, making you more vulnerable to infections and slowing wound healing. It affects your metabolism, promoting the storage of visceral fat and interfering with insulin sensitivity. It affects your brain, particularly the hippocampus, a region critical for memory and learning. Prolonged cortisol exposure can actually reduce hippocampal volume over time. And here's the particularly insidious part. These physiological effects accumulate silently. You don't necessarily feel your blood pressure rising in the moment. You don't sense your immune system becoming less responsive. The changes happen beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, building slowly over months and years of habitually pretending you're fine when you're not. Research in the field of psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the interaction between psychological processes and the nervous and immune systems, has documented connections between emotional suppression and physical health outcomes. People who chronically suppress emotions show higher rates of certain health problems. The evidence is particularly strong for cardiovascular issues. One long-term study found that emotional suppression predicted increased risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease, even after controlling for other risk factors like diet, exercise, and smoking. There's also evidence connecting suppression to inflammation. Chronic inflammation, the kind that persists at low levels throughout the body, rather than spiking in response to injury or infection, is implicated in a wide range of diseases, from diabetes to cancer to neurodegenerative conditions. Emotional suppression appears to be associated with elevated markers of inflammation in multiple studies. The mechanism likely involves the stress response system. Chronic activation leads to dysregulation, which affects how the body manages inflammatory processes. But the physiological cost of suppression isn't just about what remains elevated. It's also about what gets depleted. Maintaining suppression requires ongoing biological effort. Your body is continuously allocating resources to manage the arousal that isn't being expressed or resolved. This is effortful at a cellular level. Over time, This kind of sustained demand can contribute to what researchers call allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body from chronic stress and adaptation. Allostatic load is the price you pay for constantly adjusting to challenges without adequate recovery. It shows up in multiple systems simultaneously: your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your immune system, all showing signs of strain. And emotional suppression is one of the behaviors that contributes to this load, not dramatically in any single moment, but consistently over time. Consider what happens with muscle tension. When you suppress emotion, you often simultaneously suppress the physical expressions that would naturally accompany it. You keep your face neutral when you'd naturally frown or cry. You keep your shoulders still when you'd naturally tense them in anger. You control your breathing when it wants to quicken or catch. This requires muscular control, sustained low-level tension in the muscles responsible for facial expression, posture, and breathing. Chronic muscle tension has its own consequences. It contributes to pain, particularly in the neck, shoulders, and back. It can lead to tension headaches, and it creates a feedback loop with your emotional state. Your brain receives signals from your tense muscles, signals that indicate stress or threat, which can amplify the very emotional state you're trying to suppress. Your body, in effect, starts arguing with your intentions. There's something almost cruel about this aspect of suppression. The strategy you employ to manage your emotions creates physiological conditions that make emotional regulation harder. Your body becomes a source of signals that maintain or intensify distress, even as you work to keep a calm exterior. And none of this accounts for what suppression does to sleep. People who chronically suppress emotions often report sleep difficulties, and the relationship appears to be bidirectional. Suppression affects sleep, and poor sleep reduces your capacity for emotion regulation, which often leads to more suppression. The physiological arousal that persists from unresolved emotional states can interfere with the transition into sleep. Your sympathetic nervous system is still too active when you need parasympathetic dominance to fall asleep. You lie in bed, exhausted but wired, your body unable to settle because it's still processing activation that was never discharged. Poor sleep then degrades your daytime function. Your emotional reactivity increases. Your cognitive resources diminish. You become more vulnerable to stress and less capable of employing adaptive regulation strategies. So you lean more heavily on suppression, which feeds the physiological dysregulation, which further impairs your sleep. Another self-reinforcing cycle. The research is clear on this. Pretending you're fine doesn't just fail to make you fine. It actively creates physiological conditions that move you further from well-being. Your body keeps score, even when you're not paying attention. There's something most people don't realize about connection. When you're with another person, even in casual interaction, your nervous systems are engaged in a constant, mostly unconscious exchange of information. You're reading micro-expressions, shifts in tone, changes in posture. They're doing the same with you. This process happens so quickly and so automatically that you rarely notice it, but it's fundamental to how human beings assess whether someone is safe, trustworthy, present, whether they're being real. And when you suppress your emotions while interacting with others, when you present a fine facade while feeling something entirely different underneath, you create a specific kind of disconnect. The verbal message says one thing. The nonverbal signals, subtle as they are, say something else. This isn't usually dramatic. You probably don't look visibly distressed while claiming you're fine. But the misalignment is there, operating below the threshold of conscious detection, and other people pick up on it. Research on emotional authenticity in relationships shows that this misalignment has consequences. When there's incongruence between what someone says they're feeling and what their nonverbal behavior suggests, observers consistently report feeling less connected to that person, less trusting, less comfortable. They often can't articulate why. They just sense something is off. The interaction feels somehow hollow or incomplete. This makes evolutionary sense. For social species like humans, accurately reading others' emotional states is a survival skill. You need to know if someone is angry, afraid, or genuinely pleased to see you. That information helps you navigate the social world safely. When someone's signals are contradictory, when the words don't match the music, your brain registers this as potentially problematic. Not necessarily dangerous, but uncertain. And uncertainty in social contexts tends to produce distance, not closeness. So, when you suppress emotions to maintain social smoothness, to avoid burdening others, to keep things light, you may be achieving the opposite of what you intend. Instead of facilitating connection, you're introducing noise into the communication channel. The other person may walk away from the interaction feeling vaguely unsatisfied, unable to quite put their finger on why the conversation didn't land right. This becomes more pronounced in close relationships. With acquaintances, superficial interactions where both parties expect social scripts and polite distance, the cost of suppression might be minimal. But with intimate partners, close friends, family members, the expectations are different. These relationships are built on a foundation of emotional sharing and mutual understanding. They require vulnerability, the willingness to be seen in states other than fine. When you consistently suppress emotions in intimate relationships, you create what researchers call an intimacy paradox. You're physically close, spending time together, perhaps even discussing personal topics, but the emotional authenticity that creates genuine intimacy is absent. Your partner knows the facts of your life, but not the felt experience of it. They know your schedule, but not your struggles. And this gap is isolating, both for you and for them. Studies examining couples, where one or both partners habitually suppress emotions, find higher rates of relationship dissatisfaction. The suppressing partner often reports feeling lonely or misunderstood, which makes sense given that they're not actually sharing their internal experience. But the other partner also reports dissatisfaction, often describing a sense that something is missing, that they can't quite reach their partner, that the relationship lacks depth. There's a particular finding from this research that's worth sitting with. When one partner suppresses emotions, the other partner's physiological stress responses increase. In studies where couples discuss a conflict, if one person suppresses their emotional reactions, the other person shows elevated heart rate and blood pressure. The suppression doesn't contain the distress. It transfers it, or at least some version of it, to the other person. They're picking up on the incongruence, registering the misalignment between words and nonverbal signals, and their body is responding to that uncertainty as a form of stress. This suggests that suppression isn't just individually costly. It has relational costs that extend beyond the person doing the suppressing. The strategy you employ to protect others from your emotions may actually be creating a different kind of burden for them, the burden of sensing something is wrong, but not having enough information to understand or help. There's also the issue of modeling and reciprocity. In relationships, people tend to match each other's level of emotional openness. If you consistently suppress and present as fine, the other person is likely to do the same, even if they might otherwise be inclined to share more openly. This creates a relationship culture where both people are performing okayness while potentially struggling underneath. Neither feels safe to break the pattern because the other seems so consistently fine. The relationship becomes a mutual performance, stable perhaps, but not sustaining in the way that genuine intimacy sustains. Children are particularly attuned to emotional incongruence. They're less socialized into accepting polite fictions, more likely to notice when a parent says they're fine but clearly isn't. And when children repeatedly observe this kind of suppression, it teaches them something about emotions. It teaches them that emotions should be hidden, that authentic feeling is inappropriate or burdensome, that the acceptable way to exist in the world is to pretend everything is okay, regardless of internal reality. Research on emotional socialization shows that children of parents who suppress emotions tend to have more difficulty with emotion regulation themselves. They receive less coaching about how to understand and manage feelings because their parents aren't modeling that process. Instead, they learn suppression as the default strategy. And because suppression is cognitively costly and physiologically taxing, as we've already explored, these children may struggle more than they would have if they'd learned adaptive ways to acknowledge and process emotion. The social cost of suppression extends beyond dyadic relationships into group dynamics. In work settings, teams where members feel they must suppress emotions to maintain professionalism often show reduced creativity, less effective problem solving, and higher rates of burnout. The cognitive load of suppression, that constant background task of monitoring and controlling emotional expression, reduces the mental resources available for collaboration, innovation, and engagement with the actual work. There's also evidence that suppression affects how others perceive your competence and warmth. These are the two primary dimensions on which people evaluate each other in social contexts. Competence is about capability, effectiveness, intelligence. Warmth is about friendliness, trustworthiness, approachability. When you suppress emotions, particularly positive ones, you may be perceived as less warm. When suppression impairs your cognitive performance, as it does, you may be perceived as less competent. Neither outcome serves your interests. But perhaps the deepest cost is internal. When you habitually suppress emotions in relationships, you begin to lose touch with your own authentic responses. You become so practiced at performing okayness that you struggle to access what you actually feel, even when you're alone. The suppression that started as a social strategy becomes a way of being, something automatic that operates even when there's no audience. And this creates a particular kind of loneliness. You're surrounded by people who think they know you, who believe your reports that you're fine, who have no idea that beneath the surface you're struggling. You're isolated not by physical distance, but by the gap between your inner experience and what you allow others to see. You're hiding in plain sight. The irony is profound. The very behavior you employ to maintain relationships, to avoid burdening others, to keep yourself socially acceptable, undermines the depth and authenticity that make relationships meaningful. You end up connected in the shallowest sense, while feeling profoundly alone in the ways that matter most. There's a particular kind of learning that happens not through instruction, but through experience, through the slow accumulation of patterns that your brain begins to recognize and predict. Martin Seligman discovered this in a laboratory in the late 1960s, though what he found wasn't what he was looking for. He was studying classical conditioning in dogs, expecting to demonstrate how animals learn to associate signals with outcomes. What he found instead changed psychology's understanding of helplessness, depression, and the ways that pretending you're fine can train your brain to give up. The experiment involved dogs in a shuttle box, a chamber divided into two sides by a low barrier. One side of the floor could deliver a mild electric shock. The other side was safe. Most dogs, when shocked, quickly learned to jump the barrier to escape. Some learned to jump even before the shock, responding to a warning tone. This was expected. This was learning. But Seligman introduced a variation. Before placing dogs in the shuttle box, he exposed some of them to a different condition. These dogs were restrained in a harness and given shocks they couldn't escape. They could struggle, twist, bark, but nothing they did made any difference. The shocks came regardless of their behavior. There was no contingency between action and outcome, no control. Later, when these same dogs were placed in the shuttle box where escape was possible, something unexpected happened. They didn't try. When the shock began, they would whimper, perhaps move around briefly, but then they'd lie down and endure it. Even though escape was now possible, even though jumping the barrier would immediately end the discomfort, they didn't jump. They had learned something in the earlier condition, something that generalized to the new situation. They had learned helplessness. This wasn't about inability. The dogs were physically capable of jumping the barrier. Some had to be physically dragged over the barrier repeatedly before they would start to learn that escape was possible. The helplessness was psychological. They had learned that their actions didn't matter, and that learning was powerful enough to override their natural response to escape pain. Now consider what you're doing when you pretend you're fine while you're not. You're in a situation that's causing distress, anger, grief, anxiety, something that warrants a response. But instead of responding to the feeling, instead of acknowledging it or addressing whatever might be causing it, you suppress it. You override the signal. You maintain the facade. What are you teaching yourself in that moment? You're teaching yourself that your internal experience doesn't warrant a response, that the discomfort doesn't matter enough to acknowledge, that action in response to your emotions is inappropriate or ineffective. You're creating a contingency, or rather, a lack of contingency, between your emotional state and any meaningful response to it. Do this repeatedly, make it a habit, and you begin to learn something similar to what those dogs learned. Not that you're helpless in all domains, but that your emotional experience is something to be endured rather than addressed. That feelings are things that happen to you, not signals that might inform action or understanding. Seligman later translated this animal research into human contexts. He found that people exposed to uncontrollable stressors, situations where their actions made no difference to outcomes, showed similar patterns. They became passive in the face of later challenges, even when solutions were available. Their motivation dropped. Their problem-solving deteriorated. They showed cognitive deficits, struggling with tasks that required learning new contingencies. And they developed emotional disturbances that looked remarkably like depression. This led Seligman to propose learned helplessness as a model for understanding human depression. The core idea is that depression often follows from learning that outcomes are uncontrollable, that your actions don't matter, that you're helpless to change your situation. This learning doesn't require dramatic trauma. It can accumulate through repeated experiences of inefficacy, through situations where you try and fail, or where you're discouraged from trying at all. And here's where pretending you're fine becomes particularly problematic. When you have an emotion and you suppress it rather than responding to it, you're engaging in a form of learned avoidance. The emotion is uncomfortable, so you avoid experiencing it fully or expressing it. In the short term, this might reduce discomfort. You don't have to sit with difficult feelings. You don't have to risk the vulnerability of sharing them. But avoidance, when it becomes habitual, teaches helplessness. Each time you avoid an emotion rather than learning to navigate it, you reinforce the belief that emotions are threats to be avoided, rather than experiences to be understood and managed. You learn that you can't handle your feelings, that they're too dangerous or overwhelming to confront directly. And this learning generalizes. It's not just about one specific emotion in one specific context. It's about your overall relationship with your emotional life. Seligman's research identified 3 critical dimensions that determine whether helplessness develops: controllability, predictability, and the ability to learn new contingencies. When you repeatedly suppress emotions, you undermine all 3. You reduce controllability because you're not practicing responses that might effectively address emotional situations. You reduce predictability because suppressed emotions tend to erupt unexpectedly, as we discussed with the rebound effect. And you impair your ability to learn new emotional contingencies because you're not getting feedback about what works and what doesn't in managing emotional experiences. There's a particular finding from learned helplessness research that maps directly onto emotional suppression. In experiments with humans, participants who experienced uncontrollable stress showed something called attributional bias. They started attributing failures to stable, internal characteristics. I failed because I'm not capable, rather than, I failed because this particular situation was difficult. They generalize from specific instances to broad conclusions about themselves. When you habitually pretend you're fine, you're setting yourself up for similar attributional patterns. When suppression inevitably fails, when the emotion breaks through despite your efforts, you're likely to attribute that failure internally. I'm not strong enough. I'm too sensitive. I can't handle stress. These attributions reinforce helplessness. They frame emotional experience as something about your fundamental inadequacy, rather than something about the situation or the strategy you're employing. And because suppression is cognitively costly, because it impairs your performance in other domains as we discussed, it can create actual failures that seem to confirm these negative attributions. You suppress an emotion at work, which consumes cognitive resources, which leads to a mistake or poor performance, which reinforces the belief that you're not capable, which increases emotional distress, which leads to more suppression. The cycle feeds itself. Seligman also discovered that learned helplessness could be prevented or reversed through specific interventions. The key was providing experience with control, situations where actions clearly led to outcomes, where effort mattered. For the dogs, this meant physically showing them they could escape by dragging them over the barrier until they started trying on their own. For humans, it meant carefully designed experiences where they could see that their behavior made a difference. The parallel to emotional suppression is clear. If suppression teaches a form of helplessness about emotions, then the antidote isn't to suppress more effectively. It's to learn that you can respond to emotions in ways that matter, that your feelings are navigable rather than uncontrollable threats. This requires experiencing your emotions rather than avoiding them, and learning through practice that you can tolerate, understand, and respond to emotional experiences without being overwhelmed. But if you never allow yourself that practice, because you're always pretending you're fine, you never get the chance to learn emotional efficacy. You stay stuck in the pattern that helplessness creates, passive in relation to your own emotional life, waiting for feelings to pass rather than engaging with them as meaningful signals. Seligman's later work moved beyond helplessness toward what he called learned optimism, the idea that people can learn more adaptive ways of interpreting and responding to difficulty. But learned optimism requires first recognizing that you have agency, that your responses matter, that outcomes are at least partially under your control. Chronic suppression undermines exactly that recognition. It trains you to treat emotions as things that happen to you, endured until they pass, rather than as experiences you can engage with, learn from, and navigate. The dogs that learned helplessness didn't lose their physical capacity to jump. They lost their belief that jumping would matter. When you pretend you're fine, you're at risk of losing your belief that responding to your emotions would matter, that acknowledging difficulty could lead to anything other than more difficulty. And that loss is what transforms normal emotional experience into something that looks increasingly like depression. The dogs learned they were helpless, but then something else happened. After they learned to stop trying, after they'd sit in the shuttle box and accept the shock without attempting escape, researchers would end the session. The dogs would return to their cages. Time would pass, hours, days, and then they'd be brought back to the shuttle box for another session. What do you think happened? Did the helplessness fade with time? Did a night's rest clear the learned pattern? No. The dogs that had learned helplessness showed it again immediately. In fact, the helplessness often appeared stronger in subsequent sessions. The learned pattern didn't decay naturally. It persisted, and in some cases intensified. This points to something critical about suppression and avoidance. When you suppress an emotion, when you push it down and move on without processing it, you might assume the emotion will fade over time. That if you just wait it out, keep yourself busy, maintain the fine facade long enough, the feeling will naturally diminish. Sometimes that happens with minor irritations. But for more substantial emotions, for the distress that actually warrants attention, suppression doesn't lead to decay, it leads to rebound. Daniel Wegner, whose work on thought suppression we discussed earlier, documented this phenomenon extensively. In his experiments, participants who suppressed thoughts about a white bear didn't just experience intrusions during the suppression period. After the suppression period ended, when they were told they could think about anything, the white bear appeared even more frequently than it had. For people who'd never suppressed it, the act of suppression created a rebound effect, making the unwanted thought more prominent afterward. This happens with emotions too, and the mechanisms are similar. When you suppress an emotional response, you're activating that monitoring process that constantly scans for signs of the unwanted feeling so it can be redirected. Every time the monitor detects the emotion, it creates a small activation, a brief moment where the feeling enters awareness before being pushed away. These repeated activations, counterintuitively, strengthen the association between whatever triggered the emotion and the emotional response itself. It's like this. Imagine you're at a social gathering and someone makes a comment that angers you. You decide not to react. You suppress the anger, smile, continue the conversation. But internally, your monitoring process is now actively watching for anger. Every few seconds it checks. Am I still angry? Is the anger showing? This checking requires briefly accessing the anger to assess it. Each access is a small activation of the anger network in your brain. By the end of the evening, you've activated the anger response dozens or hundreds of times, far more than if you'd simply acknowledged it once and moved on. Later, when you're home and the suppression effort ends, when your cognitive resources are depleted and the monitor weakens, all those activations have primed the anger network. The emotion rebounds, often feeling more intense than it did initially. You find yourself ruminating about the comment, replaying the interaction, feeling even angrier than you did in the moment. The suppression didn't eliminate the emotion, it amplified it. Research measuring emotional intensity over time shows this pattern clearly. Participants who suppress emotional responses report stronger emotions later, compared to those who experienced and expressed emotions naturally in the moment. The delay between suppression and rebound varies, but the rebound itself is remarkably consistent. And it's not just that the emotion comes back. It often comes back attached to increased physiological arousal, more negative thoughts, and a greater sense that the emotion is uncontrollable. Remember, suppression teaches a form of helplessness. When the suppressed emotion rebounds despite your efforts to contain it, it confirms the belief that your emotions are ungovernable forces. This increases anxiety about future emotional experiences, which increases the impulse to suppress, which makes the rebound worse the next time. There's also evidence that repeated suppression changes baseline emotional states. People who chronically suppress don't just experience rebound spikes of specific emotions. They show higher overall levels of negative emotion, even during periods that should be neutral. One study tracked participants' emotional experiences throughout their days using experience sampling, prompting them at random intervals to report what they were feeling. Those who reported high habitual suppression showed more negative emotion during mundane activities, times when nothing particularly distressing was happening. This suggests that chronic suppression creates a kind of emotional debt. Each suppressed experience leaves residue, unprocessed emotional content that accumulates in the background. Your baseline state gradually shifts toward more negativity, more tension, more sense of something being wrong, even when you can't identify what. You're carrying the weight of all the emotions you've told yourself you're not feeling. The rebound effect also helps explain why suppression often fails catastrophically rather than gradually. People who suppress consistently sometimes describe sudden breakdowns, moments when the carefully maintained composure collapses all at once. They're fine, fine, fine. And then suddenly, they're very much not fine, overwhelmed by emotion that seems to come out of nowhere. But it's not from nowhere. It's the accumulated rebound of suppressed experiences, finally overwhelming the cognitive resources available to contain them. These breakdowns often happen during periods of stress or cognitive load, times when executive function is already taxed. You're managing a difficult project at work, dealing with a family crisis, not sleeping well. Your capacity for suppression diminishes. All the emotions you've been holding back sense the weakness in the defenses and flood through. The result can be intense and disorienting, precisely because you haven't been processing emotions incrementally. You've created a dam, and now it's breaking. There's something particularly cruel about the timing of rebounds. They often occur during moments that should be restorative. You've made it through a stressful week, you're finally relaxing on the weekend, and suddenly you're flooded with anxiety, or sadness or anger that you thought you'd moved past. The relief of lowered demands reduces your suppression capacity, and the rebound arrives. What should be recovery time becomes crisis management. Wegner's research also identified factors that intensify the rebound. Stress makes it worse. Cognitive load makes it worse. Ambiguity about whether suppression is still required makes it worse. And attempts to suppress multiple things simultaneously make it much worse. Each additional target of suppression increases the monitoring burden, which depletes resources, which weakens all the suppressions and increases rebound for all of them. This is why people often describe feeling overwhelmed by a cascade of different emotions rather than just one. If you've been suppressing anxiety about work, irritation at a friend, sadness about a loss, and worry about your health, all simultaneously, the rebound doesn't politely queue up one emotion at a time. All the monitoring processes weaken together. All the rebounds arrive together. You're suddenly dealing with multiple intense emotions whose connections to their original triggers may be unclear because time has passed and suppression has obscured the links. The rebound effect also appears to involve memory processes. When you suppress an emotional experience, you don't fully encode it. The memory of the event is fragmented, containing the facts perhaps but missing the emotional context. Later, when the emotion rebounds, it may feel disconnected from any specific cause. You're angry, but can't quite remember why. You're sad, but the sadness feels generalized rather than tied to particular losses. This disconnection makes the rebounded emotion harder to process. Normally, you can address an emotion by addressing its cause, changing the situation, reappraising the meaning, or simply acknowledging that a response made sense given what happened. But when the emotion has rebounded in a decontextualized form, these strategies are less available. You're trying to address a feeling whose origins are obscured, so the emotion persists longer, feels more uncontrollable, and increases the sense that your emotional life is chaotic and ungovernable. The accumulated evidence points to a hard conclusion. Suppression doesn't make emotions go away. It postpones them, intensifies them, and strips away the contextual information that would make them navigable. You're not managing emotions through suppression. You're storing them, with interest, for a later date when you'll be less equipped to handle them. The pretense of being fine creates exactly the conditions that will make you decidedly not fine. Seligman's early work on learned helplessness revealed something about how organisms learn patterns of inefficacy, but his later research uncovered something more subtle and perhaps more important. It wasn't just whether bad things happened to you that determined whether you became helpless or depressed. It was how you explained those bad things to yourself. The stories you told about why events occurred, what they meant about you and your future, turned out to be critical. He called this explanatory style, and it operates along 3 dimensions. When something bad happens, you can explain it as permanent or temporary. You can explain it as pervasive or specific, and you can explain it as personal or external. The pattern of explanations you habitually use, often without conscious awareness, shapes whether you develop helplessness or maintain resilience. A pessimistic explanatory style explains bad events as permanent. This always happens to me. Things never work out. I'll always struggle with this. It explains them as pervasive. I'm bad at everything. My whole life is falling apart. Nothing goes right. And it explains them as personal. It's my fault. I'm the problem. There's something wrong with me. This pattern of explanation, stable and internal and global, creates vulnerability to depression and helplessness. An optimistic explanatory style does the opposite. Bad events are temporary. This is a rough patch. This particular situation is difficult right now. They're specific. I struggled with this one thing. This aspect of my life is challenging. And they're external when appropriate. The circumstances were difficult. Multiple factors contributed to this outcome. This pattern, unstable and external and specific, creates resilience. Now consider what happens when you pretend you're fine. You're experiencing something difficult, something that warrants acknowledgement or response, but you're telling yourself and others that everything is okay. What explanatory narrative does this require? If you're feeling terrible but saying you're fine, you need an explanation for the gap between your internal experience and your external presentation. The most available explanation, the one that makes intuitive sense, is often personal and stable. I should be able to handle this. Other people handle this. The fact that I'm struggling means there's something wrong with me. I'm too sensitive. I'm not strong enough. I'm fundamentally flawed. This is a pessimistic, explanatory style applied to your emotional experience. The difficulty is framed as permanent, something about your enduring inadequacy. It's framed as pervasive, evidence of a broad inability to cope. And it's framed as personal, something about your inherent weakness rather than about the situation's demands. Do this habitually, and you're training yourself in pessimistic explanation. Each time you suppress an emotion and frame it as evidence that you should be better, stronger, more capable of being fine, you're strengthening the cognitive pattern that Seligman identified as central to helplessness and depression. Seligman's research showed that explanatory style could be measured and that it predicted outcomes. People with pessimistic explanatory styles were more likely to become depressed when facing stress. They performed worse academically, even controlling for ability. They had worse health outcomes. They gave up more quickly when facing challenges. The stories they told about why things happened shaped the actual unfolding of their lives. He also found that explanatory style wasn't fixed. It could be learned and unlearned. Children acquired explanatory styles from parents and teachers, from the feedback they received about their successes and failures, from the models of explanation they observed. And adults could shift their explanatory styles through deliberate practice, through learning to notice their automatic explanations and generate alternatives. But if you're pretending you're fine, you're practicing the wrong direction. You're not learning to generate optimistic alternatives. You're rehearsing pessimistic narratives about your emotional experience. I shouldn't feel this way. I should be over this by now. Everyone else manages fine. What's wrong with me that I can't? These narratives are rarely examined. They operate as background assumptions, as obvious truths rather than as one particular way of interpreting experience. But they're destructive in exactly the ways Seligman's research predicts. They create expectations of continued difficulty. They undermine motivation to try new approaches. They transform specific emotional challenges into evidence of global inadequacy. There's a particular pattern Seligman identified in how people with pessimistic styles explain good events versus bad events. Bad events are permanent, pervasive, and personal, but good events are temporary, specific, and external. I got lucky. It was easy. They were being nice. This pattern maximizes the impact of negative experiences while minimizing positive ones. When you pretend you're fine, you can fall into a version of this. The times when you genuinely are fine become invisible, unremarkable, not worth noting. Of course you're fine. That's the baseline expectation. But the times when you're struggling, even though you're hiding it, become salient evidence of your inadequacy. You don't give yourself credit for the emotional resilience you actually demonstrate. You only register the fact that you're sometimes not fine as proof that something is wrong with you. Seligman also distinguished between explanatory style for outcomes and explanatory style for causes. It's one thing to explain why something happened. It's another to explain what it means for the future. Pessimistic style tends to see bad events as predictive. This happened. Therefore, similar bad things will keep happening. Optimistic style sees bad events as informative, but not deterministic. This happened. What can I learn from it to navigate future situations differently? When you suppress emotions instead of processing them, you lose the opportunity to extract information. The emotion just becomes something that happened, something you endured. You don't learn what triggered it, what made it worse or better, what you might do differently. So each difficult emotional experience becomes just another data point confirming that you struggle, rather than a learning opportunity that might improve future coping. This connects back to learned helplessness. Helplessness develops when you learn that your responses don't affect outcomes. Pessimistic explanatory style is essentially a cognitive version of that learning. It's the belief that bad outcomes will persist regardless of what you do, because they're caused by stable, pervasive, personal factors you can't change. And when you pretend you're fine while struggling, you're confirming that belief through direct experience. Your actions, your attempts to suppress and appear okay, don't actually make you feel better. The distress persists beneath the facade. This is a lived experience of inefficacy. Your coping attempt doesn't work, and the pessimistic explanation is right there waiting. Of course it doesn't work. I can't handle this. Nothing I do will help. The insidious part is that this explanation prevents you from trying alternatives. If your struggle is permanent, pervasive, and personal, then trying a different approach wouldn't help. Why bother acknowledging the emotion if you're just fundamentally bad at managing feelings? Why reach out for support if you're uniquely inadequate? The pessimistic explanation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, blocking access to the very behaviors that might generate more optimistic evidence. Seligman later expanded his work into what he called learned optimism, developing interventions to help people shift explanatory styles. The core technique was surprisingly simple. Notice your automatic explanations. Treat them as hypotheses rather than facts. Generate alternative explanations. Maybe I'm struggling because this situation is genuinely difficult, not because I'm defective. Maybe this is temporary, related to specific stressors that will change. Maybe I need support, not because I'm weak, but because this is how human beings navigate hard things. But you can't practice learned optimism while maintaining the pretense that you're fine. The pretense requires the pessimistic explanation. It requires framing your internal experience as something wrong with you, rather than something understandable about the situation. It locks you into exactly the explanatory pattern that creates vulnerability. The story you tell yourself about why you're pretending to be fine is rarely, "I'm navigating a genuinely difficult situation with limited resources and doing the best I can." It's usually some version of, "I should be better than this." And that second story, that permanent, pervasive, personal explanation, is the story that makes things worse. You're standing in front of an open refrigerator at 2 in the morning, not particularly hungry, vaguely aware that you're looking for something but not sure what. Or you're scrolling through your phone for the 40th time in an hour, seeing nothing new, feeling a restless dissatisfaction that doesn't quite resolve. Or you notice your jaw is clenched, has been for hours, and you can't remember when it started. These moments, mundane and easy to dismiss, are often your emotions trying to communicate. Not loudly, not dramatically, just persistent signals that something needs attention. Hunger that isn't about food. Restlessness that isn't about boredom. Tension that isn't about your posture. Emotions evolved as information systems. Fear tells you something might be dangerous. Anger tells you a boundary has been violated. Sadness tells you something valuable has been lost. Disgust tells you something should be avoided. Even anxiety, often dismissed as irrational, contains information about uncertainty and the need to prepare or gather more data. These aren't arbitrary feelings that happen to you for no reason. They're adaptive responses shaped by evolution to help you navigate a complex world. They arise in response to specific triggers, patterns your brain has learned to recognize as significant, and they motivate specific action tendencies. Fear motivates escape or caution. Anger motivates confrontation or boundary defense. Sadness motivates withdrawal and reassessment. But here's what's critical. These signals only remain useful if you can receive them, if you can decode what they're pointing toward. And when you suppress emotions, when you override the signal in favor of appearing fine, you lose access to the information those emotions contain. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on emotion construction reveals something important about how this information system works. Emotions aren't just reactions that happen to you. Your brain is constantly making predictions about what you're feeling based on incoming sensory data from your body and your environment. It's trying to explain bodily sensations, trying to make sense of increased heart rate or muscle tension or changes in breathing. When you suppress an emotion, you're not eliminating the bodily sensations that gave rise to it. You're just refusing to label them accurately. Your heart is still racing. Your stomach is still tight. Your breathing is still shallow. But instead of interpreting these signals as anxiety about a specific situation, you might just feel vaguely unwell or tired or nothing in particular. The information is there, but it's not being decoded. This is why people who chronically suppress often describe feeling disconnected from themselves, uncertain about what they actually feel or want. They've trained themselves to ignore the signals their body and brain are constantly sending. The information system is functioning, generating data about what matters and what requires response, but the receiver isn't processing the input, and emotions contain very specific information. It's not just something is wrong. It's this particular thing is wrong in this particular way and might require this particular kind of response. Anxiety about a deadline is information about time management and preparation needs. Anger at a colleague is information about expectations being violated and relationship repair being needed. Sadness about a friendship drifting is information about values around connection and perhaps a need to reach out. When you suppress instead of decode, you lose all that specificity. You're just vaguely uncomfortable, vaguely off, unable to pinpoint what's wrong or what might help. This makes effective response nearly impossible. You can't address a problem you can't identify. There's also secondary information that emotions provide about patterns over time. If you notice you feel anxious every Sunday evening, that's information about your work situation or your relationship to Mondays. If you notice you feel irritable after conversations with a particular person, that's information about that relationship dynamic. If you notice you feel sad when you're alone but fine when you're busy, that's information about how you're using activity to avoid something. But pattern recognition requires that you actually notice and label emotions as they occur. If you're always pretending you're fine, you never build the database of emotional experiences that would allow pattern recognition. Each difficult feeling is just endured and dismissed rather than cataloged and analyzed. Emotional information also has a time-sensitive quality. Emotions arise in response to situations that are present right now. Fear about something happening in this moment prepares you to respond in this moment. Anger about a boundary violation is most useful when you can address it while the situation is still active. The information emotions provide is perishable. When you suppress an emotion, by the time it rebounds later, often the moment for useful response has passed. You're angry 3 days after the conversation where someone crossed a line, but the person isn't there anymore, and raising it now feels awkward or disproportionate. You're anxious about the deadline after it's already been missed. The emotion still arrives, still demands attention, but it can no longer serve its adaptive function because the situation has moved on. This creates a strange existence where you're constantly experiencing emotions that feel irrelevant or disconnected from your current circumstances. You're sad, but you're not sure why. You're angry, but the trigger is long past. The emotions are providing information, but it's outdated information, and you haven't learned to connect it back to the situations that generated it because suppression obscured those connections. Research on emotional granularity, the ability to make fine-grained distinctions between emotional states, shows that people who can differentiate precisely among emotions have better mental health outcomes. They're more resilient. They regulate emotions more effectively. they make better decisions in emotionally charged situations. Emotional granularity requires practice. You have to pay attention to your emotions, label them, notice the subtle differences between frustration and disappointment, between anxiety and excitement, between loneliness and boredom. Each distinction adds information, helps you understand more precisely what's happening and what might help. But suppression eliminates the opportunity to practice granularity. Everything gets flattened into fine or not fine, okay or not okay. You lose the nuance that makes emotions useful as navigation tools. You're trying to steer through life with a dashboard that only has two lights, and you've decided to ignore one of them. There's also the reality that some emotions contain information about needs that aren't currently being met. Loneliness tells you connection is needed. Boredom tells you stimulation or purpose is needed. Frustration tells you progress toward a goal is being blocked. These are maintenance signals, your psychological equivalent of thirst or hunger, telling you when something essential is running low. If you suppress these signals, the needs don't go away. They accumulate. You end up depleted in ways you don't consciously recognize until the depletion creates crisis. You haven't connected with anyone meaningfully in months, but you told yourself you were fine with being busy. You haven't done anything genuinely engaging or purposeful, but you told yourself you were content. The needs were signaling the whole time. You just weren't listening. And here's perhaps the most important piece. Emotions don't just provide information about problems. They also provide information about what you value, what matters to you, what you find meaningful. You feel angry when values around fairness or respect are violated. You feel sad when you lose something you cared about. You feel afraid when something you value is threatened. You feel joy when something you value is present or increasing. When you suppress emotions, you lose access to this value information. You drift away from knowing what actually matters to you, what you're working toward, what kind of life you're trying to build. You become reactive, responding to external demands and expectations, but disconnected from internal guidance about direction and purpose. The information is still there. Your emotions are still arising in response to what matters and what needs attention. But you're the person standing at the refrigerator at 2 in the morning, looking for something, knowing something is missing, but unable to identify what it is because you've trained yourself not to listen to the signals that would tell you. In 2011, Martin Seligman published a book that marked a shift in his thinking. After decades studying helplessness, depression, and the cognitive patterns that create suffering, he proposed a new framework for understanding human flourishing. He called it PERMA, an acronym for 5 elements he considered essential to well-being: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. These weren't arbitrary categories. They emerged from research across psychology, from studies of what actually predicts life satisfaction, from longitudinal data showing what sustains people through difficulty. The model suggested that well-being isn't just the absence of distress. It's the presence of these 5 elements working together to create a life that feels worth living. But here's what's crucial for understanding why pretending you're fine undermines well-being. PERMA isn't about appearing to have these things. It's about actually experiencing them. And suppression creates a specific kind of fragility where you might have the external markers of well-being while lacking the internal experience of it. Start with positive emotion. Seligman meant genuine experiences of joy, gratitude, contentment, pleasure, the felt sense of things being good. Not performance of happiness, not the maintained facade of okayness, actual positive feeling. When you habitually suppress difficult emotions, you don't just suppress those. Suppression is a blunt instrument. Research shows that people who suppress negative emotions also experience reduced positive emotions. The constant monitoring and control required to keep difficult feelings contained dampens your overall emotional responsiveness. You become emotionally flattened, less able to fully experience joy or pleasure, even when circumstances warrant those feelings. There's also something about the contrast between emotions that makes positive feelings meaningful. Joy feels joyful partly in contrast to times that weren't joyful. Relief requires having been tense. Contentment requires having been restless. When you suppress the full range of emotional experience, you lose some of the texture that makes positive emotions vivid and satisfying. So you might look fine. You might be going through motions that should generate positive emotion. spending time with friends, achieving goals, engaging in activities you theoretically enjoy. But the felt experience is muted. You're checking boxes rather than feeling anything deep. You have pseudo-positive emotion, the appearance without the substance. Engagement is the second element. Seligman drew on Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, that state of absorbed attention where you're fully immersed in an activity, where time seems to shift, where self-consciousness falls away. Engagement requires that your full cognitive resources are available and directed toward what you're doing. But we've already established that suppression is cognitively expensive. It consumes working memory and executive function. When you're suppressing emotion, part of your attention is always allocated to monitoring and control. You're never fully present. You're never fully engaged. You might be good at your work. You might be productive. But true engagement, the kind that's deeply satisfying and restorative, requires total absorption. Suppression makes that impossible. There's always a background process running, always a part of your awareness allocated to maintaining the facade, always a gap between you and full presence in the moment. Relationships, the third element, might be the most obviously undermined by suppression. We've already explored how suppression creates distance, how the incongruence between internal experience and external presentation makes genuine intimacy difficult. But it's worth emphasizing how central relationships are to Seligman's model of well-being. Human beings are fundamentally social. We evolved in groups. Our nervous systems regulate through connection with others. Our sense of meaning and purpose is often tied to our relationships. When your relationships are shallow or strained because you're always pretending you're fine, you're missing one of the 5 core elements of well-being. And you can have many relationships while still lacking this element. You can be surrounded by people who think they know you. But if none of them know your actual internal experience, if you're performing okayness while feeling isolated underneath, you don't have the kind of relationships that contribute to flourishing. You have a social network that doesn't actually sustain you. Meaning is the fourth element. This refers to belonging to and serving something you believe is bigger than yourself. Purpose, contribution, connection to values or causes or communities that matter. Meaning provides the answer to why you're doing what you're doing, what it's all for. Suppression interferes with meaning in a subtle but important way. Remember that emotions provide information about values. They tell you what matters. When you suppress emotional responses, you lose access to that value information. You drift away from clarity about what you actually find meaningful versus what you're doing because it's expected or habitual. People who suppress chronically often describe feeling like they're going through motions, following a script, but not sure why or whether it aligns with what they actually care about. They've lost touch with the emotional signals that would connect their daily actions to deeper sources of meaning. They're busy, perhaps even, successful by external measures, but feeling hollow because the connection to purpose has been severed. Accomplishment is the fifth element. Achievement, competence, mastery, the sense that you're making progress toward goals that matter to you. This requires both setting meaningful goals and having the capacity to pursue them effectively. Suppression undermines both. First, as we've discussed, suppression impairs cognitive performance. It makes you less effective at the tasks that would generate accomplishment. Second, the goals you pursue when you're disconnected from your emotions may not be goals that actually matter to you. You might be achieving things that look impressive while feeling empty because you've lost touch with what accomplishment would actually feel meaningful to you. There's also the issue that genuine accomplishment requires resilience, the ability to persist through difficulty and setback. But suppression, as we've seen, teaches helplessness. It trains you to see challenges as evidence of inadequacy rather than as normal parts of pursuing difficult goals. This makes you fragile in exactly the domain where accomplishment requires strength. Seligman emphasized that these 5 elements work together. They're not independent. Positive emotion often arises from engagement or from meaningful relationships. Accomplishment creates positive emotion and often serves meaning. Engagement happens more easily in the context of meaningful work or with people you're connected to. The elements reinforce each other, creating an upward spiral toward flourishing. But suppression disrupts this synergy. When you're emotionally flattened, you can't fully engage. When you can't fully engage, accomplishment feels hollow. When relationships are shallow, positive emotion is muted. When meaning is unclear, accomplishment loses purpose. Suppression introduces friction into all 5 elements simultaneously, preventing them from supporting each other the way they should. This creates what might be called pseudo-well-being. From the outside, everything looks fine. You're functioning. You have a job, relationships, activities, achievements. The structural elements of a good life are present. But the experiential elements, the actual felt sense of well-being, are absent or muted. And this pseudo-well-being is fragile. It doesn't sustain you through difficulty because it's not rooted in genuine experience of the 5 elements. When stress increases or circumstances change, the facade cracks easily. You don't have the deep resources that real well-being provides because you've been maintaining appearance without substance. Seligman's later work emphasized building these 5 elements intentionally, practicing gratitude to increase positive emotion, seeking flow activities for engagement, investing in relationships, connecting daily actions to larger meaning, pursuing mastery in domains you care about. But all of these practices require emotional authenticity. They require that you're actually experiencing what you're experiencing, not performing okayness while feeling disconnected underneath. You can't practice gratitude while suppressing the full range of your emotional life. You can't achieve flow while allocating cognitive resources to monitoring and control. You can't build genuine relationships without emotional honesty. You can't find meaning without listening to the emotional signals that tell you what matters. You can't experience accomplishment as satisfying without allowing yourself to feel both the struggle and the success. Pretending you're fine might create the appearance of well-being, but it systematically undermines the actual experience of the 5 elements Seligman identified as essential to human flourishing. You end up with a life that looks good from the outside, but feels empty from the inside, vulnerable to collapse precisely because it was never built on solid ground. There's a difference between suppression and rumination, though at first they might seem like opposites. Suppression is the refusal to engage with emotional content. Rumination is the inability to stop engaging with it. But they're both dysfunctional, and interestingly, they often create each other. When you suppress an emotion during the day, when you push it down and refuse to process it, where does it go? Often, it shows up later as rumination. You're lying in bed, trying to sleep, and suddenly you're replaying the conversation from 3 days ago, the one you told yourself didn't bother you. You're analyzing what was said, generating alternative responses you could have given, imagining future scenarios where similar conflicts might occur. The emotion you suppressed is now demanding attention in the form of repetitive, unproductive thinking. Rumination feels like you're doing something. You're thinking about the problem. You're analyzing. But research distinguishes clearly between rumination and constructive processing. Rumination is repetitive and passive. You're going over the same ground without reaching resolution or new understanding. It's abstract rather than concrete. You're thinking about what it all means about you, whether you're adequate, why things always happen this way, rather than thinking through specific actions you might take. Constructive processing, by contrast, is active and moves forward. You're acknowledging the emotion, identifying what triggered it, considering what you might do differently, making meaning of the experience in a way that leads to learning or closure. It has an arc. You enter the processing with a question or distress, and you exit with greater clarity or a decision, or at least a sense of having understood something. Susan Nolan Hoeksema spent her career studying rumination, particularly its role in depression. She found that people who ruminate in response to distress are significantly more likely to develop depression and to have longer, more severe depressive episodes. Rumination prolongs negative mood states rather than resolving them. It amplifies distress rather than processing it. And here's the connection to suppression. Nolan Hoeksema found that people often ruminate precisely because they haven't processed emotions when those emotions arose. The suppressed content remains unresolved, so the mind keeps circling back to it, trying to make sense of something that was never fully acknowledged in the first place. There's also a quality of rumination that mirrors the helplessness we discussed earlier. Rumination often focuses on questions that can't be answered. Why do I always mess things up? Why can't I handle things better? What's wrong with me? These questions are unanswerable because they're based on distorted premises. You don't always mess things up. The issue isn't that you can't handle things. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. But rumination doesn't challenge these premises. It accepts them and spins in circles trying to explain the unexplainable. The alternative to both suppression and rumination is something closer to what emotion researchers call adaptive processing. This involves several elements that are worth examining carefully. First, acknowledgement. Simply recognizing that you're having an emotional response, naming it with some specificity. I'm anxious about the presentation. I'm angry about how that conversation went. I'm sad about the friendship changing. Not dramatizing it, not suppressing it, just acknowledging it as a fact of your current experience. This might sound trivially simple, but for people habituated to suppression, it's not. Acknowledgement requires pausing, directing attention inward, and stating something true about your internal experience. It requires overriding the impulse to immediately say you're fine. Second, allowing. This means giving the emotion some space to be present without immediately trying to change it or make it go away. Not wallowing, not catastrophizing, but also not rushing to fix or eliminate the feeling. Just letting it exist for a few moments while you observe it. Allowing is particularly difficult for people who've learned to fear their emotions, who believe that acknowledging feelings will lead to being overwhelmed. But research on emotional exposure, the deliberate practice of experiencing emotions without avoidance, shows the opposite. Emotions that are allowed to be present tend to peak and then naturally decline. It's the avoidance that maintains them. Third, curiosity. Approaching the emotion with questions rather than judgments. What is this emotion responding to? What might it be trying to tell me? What need or value is connected to this feeling? Curiosity shifts you out of the threat response that often accompanies strong emotion. It engages the problem-solving, meaning-making parts of your brain, rather than just the alarm systems. Fourth, expression, but not necessarily in the form of emotional display. Expression can be writing in a journal, talking to someone you trust, engaging in physical activity that discharges the physiological arousal, creating art, any behavior that externalizes the internal experience in some form. James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing demonstrates the power of this kind of expression. In study after study, people who wrote about emotional experiences, particularly traumatic or difficult ones, showed improvements in physical health, immune function, psychological well-being, even academic and work performance. The writing didn't need to be shared with anyone. It didn't need to be eloquent. It just needed to be honest, to translate the internal experience into words on a page. The mechanism appears to be that expression helps integrate the experience, connects the emotional response to the narrative of your life, creates coherence where there was just disconnected distress. It moves the emotion from something happening to you to something you've experienced and made sense of. Fifth, response. This doesn't mean you have to take action in response to every emotion, but adaptive processing involves at least considering whether action is warranted. Given that I'm feeling this, is there something I need to do? A conversation to have, a boundary to set, a change to make, a need to address? Sometimes the answer is yes, and the emotion has successfully communicated information that leads to adaptive behavior. Sometimes the answer is no, and the emotion is acknowledged but doesn't require external action. Either way, you've completed the loop. The emotion arose, was processed, and you made a decision about response. Sixth, reappraisal. This is the process Seligman emphasized in his work on learned optimism. Taking the automatic explanation you generated for an event and deliberately considering alternatives. Not denial, not forced positive thinking, but genuine examination of whether your first interpretation is the only or most accurate one. I'm anxious about the presentation because I'm terrible at public speaking might be reappraised as, I'm anxious because this presentation is important and I want to do well, which is understandable. Same emotion, different explanation, different implications for what it means about you and what you might do about it. Reappraisal doesn't eliminate emotions, but it can change their intensity and meaning. It interrupts the pessimistic explanatory style that turns normal emotional responses into evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The difference between these adaptive strategies and both suppression and rumination is striking. Suppression is refusal to engage. Rumination is stuck engagement. Adaptive processing is engaged processing that moves toward resolution. And critically, adaptive processing is a skill. It improves with practice. The first few times you try to acknowledge and allow an emotion instead of suppressing it, it might feel overwhelming or unfamiliar. But over time, you develop confidence that you can experience emotions without being destroyed by them. You build a repertoire of strategies for processing different kinds of emotional experiences. You learn through direct experience that emotions are navigable, but if you're always pretending you're fine, you never get this practice. You never build the skill. You remain stuck with the belief that emotions must be suppressed because you've never learned any other way to manage them. The suppression that feels protective is actually preventing you from developing the competence that would make protection unnecessary. There's a concept in psychology called psychological flexibility, and it might be one of the most important ideas for understanding mental health. It's not about being happy all the time or never experiencing difficulty. It's about being able to be present with your experience, whatever it is, and choosing behavior based on your values rather than being controlled by avoidance of discomfort. Stephen Hayes, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, describes psychological flexibility as having several core components: the ability to be present in the moment, the ability to accept internal experiences, thoughts, and feelings, without needing to change or eliminate them, the ability to see your thoughts as mental events rather than literal truths, the ability to maintain a sense of self that's broader than any single thought or feeling, and the ability to identify what matters to you and take action in that direction, even when it's uncomfortable. Notice that none of this involves pretending you're fine. In fact, pretending you're fine is essentially the opposite of psychological flexibility. It's rigid control. It's avoidance-driven behavior. It's the refusal to be present with difficult internal experiences. The flexibility metaphor is useful. A tree that's flexible bends in the wind without breaking. A rigid tree snaps. Human beings face psychological winds constantly: stress, loss, conflict, uncertainty, disappointment. The question isn't whether you'll face these things. The question is whether you have the flexibility to bend without breaking. And suppression, the constant effort to appear fine regardless of internal reality, is a form of rigidity. You've decided that certain internal experiences are unacceptable, that you must maintain a specific external presentation, that deviation from okayness is failure. This rigidity makes you brittle. When stress exceeds your capacity to suppress, you don't bend, you break. Hayes emphasizes acceptance as central to flexibility, but acceptance doesn't mean resignation or passive tolerance of harm. It means acknowledging what's actually present in your experience, rather than fighting reality. You can accept that you're anxious about something while still taking action to address it. You can accept that you're grieving a loss while still engaging with life. You can accept that a situation is difficult while still working to change it. The opposite of acceptance, what Hayes calls experiential avoidance, is the attempt to control or eliminate unwanted internal experiences. Suppression is a form of experiential avoidance. You're avoiding the experience of difficult emotions by refusing to acknowledge them. Research on experiential avoidance shows that it's associated with nearly every form of psychological distress. Anxiety disorders, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, all involve patterns of avoiding unwanted internal experiences. The avoidance creates short-term relief, but long-term problems. You temporarily don't have to feel the difficult feeling, but the avoidance itself becomes a source of suffering and limits your life in significant ways. Psychological flexibility involves willingness instead of avoidance. Willingness to feel what you feel, think what you think, remember what you remember, all while still moving toward what matters to you. This isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be, but it's workable in a way that avoidance isn't. Seligman's later work, particularly on resilience, converged with these ideas. He studied people who maintained well-being despite facing significant adversity. What distinguished resilient individuals wasn't the absence of difficult emotions or stress. It was the ability to acknowledge difficulty without being defined by it, to experience distress without catastrophizing, to maintain connection to meaning and purpose even while struggling. Resilience, in Seligman's framework, isn't about toughness in the sense of not feeling things. It's about flexibility in the sense of being able to experience the full range of human emotion while still functioning, still connecting, still pursuing what matters. It's the capacity to say, "This is hard and I'm struggling," without that becoming, "Therefore I'm broken and hopeless." He identified several skills that build resilience: realistic optimism, which we've discussed in terms of explanatory style, the ability to generate optimistic explanations when appropriate, while still seeing situations clearly; cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider multiple perspectives and solutions rather than getting locked into one interpretation; social connection, reaching out rather than isolating when things are difficult; and meaning, maintaining connection to purpose even during dark times. Notice that every single one of these skills requires not pretending you're fine. Realistic optimism requires acknowledging difficulty before reframing it. Cognitive flexibility requires recognizing your automatic thoughts so you can consider alternatives. Social connection requires authenticity about your actual state. Meaning requires emotional honesty about what matters to you. Pretending you're fine is anti-resilience. It's the refusal to acknowledge difficulty, which means you can't practice any of the skills that would help you navigate it. You're trying to avoid the very experiences that, when processed adaptively, build the strength to handle future challenges. There's a particular study from Seligman's resilience research that's worth considering. He worked with the U.S. Army to develop resilience training for soldiers, people who face extraordinary stress and trauma. The training didn't teach soldiers to suppress emotions or maintain a stoic facade. It taught them to acknowledge stress reactions as normal, to identify their thoughts and challenge catastrophic interpretations, to maintain social connections, to connect their daily actions to larger meaning. The soldiers who went through this training showed better mental health outcomes, fewer symptoms of depression and PTSD, better performance under stress. They didn't become emotionless, they became emotionally skilled. They developed flexibility where others had only rigid suppression. This has implications far beyond military contexts. If people facing combat stress benefit from acknowledgement and processing rather than suppression, how much more true is this for the kinds of stress most people face? Work pressure, relationship conflicts, health concerns, existential questions about meaning and purpose. These warrant emotional acknowledgement, not suppression. Building psychological flexibility is a practice. It starts with small moments of willingness. Instead of immediately suppressing a difficult feeling, you pause and acknowledge it. I'm feeling anxious right now. That's it. You're not necessarily doing anything about it yet. You're just being present with what's actually true. Then maybe you practice allowing it to be there for a moment without rushing to change it. You notice where you feel it in your body, what thoughts accompany it, what the texture of the experience is. You're building familiarity with your own emotional landscape. Then maybe you get curious about values. Given that I'm anxious, what does that tell me about what matters? What would I do in this situation if I weren't controlled by the desire to avoid this feeling? And then maybe you take action based on values rather than based on avoidance. None of this is dramatic. It's quiet, internal work. But it's the work that builds genuine resilience and flexibility. It's the practice of being present with yourself as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be. And here's what Seligman found. People who develop this kind of flexibility don't have fewer challenges. They don't live stress-free lives, but they suffer less in the face of those challenges. They maintain well-being not by avoiding difficulty, but by having the skills to navigate it. They can bend without breaking because they've practiced bending, practiced acknowledging difficulty and processing it, and continuing forward. The promise of pretending you're fine is that if you can just maintain the facade long enough, eventually you will be fine. But the research suggests the opposite. The more you practice suppression and avoidance, the more rigid you become. The less equipped you are to handle the difficulties that inevitably arise, the more brittle your psychological state. The alternative isn't to collapse into your emotions or to make emotional expression the center of your life. It's to develop the flexibility to acknowledge what's present, to make room for the full range of human experience, and to choose your actions based on what matters rather than on what's most comfortable in the moment. That flexibility, that willingness to be present with difficulty while still engaging with life, is what resilience actually looks like. And it begins the moment you stop pretending you're fine and start acknowledging what's actually true. You wake up, and your first thought isn't about what you need together. They're not independent. Positive emotion often arises from engagement or meaningful relationships. Accomplishment creates positive emotion and often serves meaning. Engagement happens more easily in context of meaningful work or with people you're connected to. The elements reinforce each other, creating an upward spiral. But suppression disrupts this synergy. When you're emotionally flattened, you can't fully engage. When you can't engage, accomplishment feels hollow. When relationships are shallow, positive emotion is muted. When meaning is unclear, accomplishment loses purpose. Suppression introduces friction into all five simultaneously, preventing them from supporting each other. This creates what might be called pseudo-well-being. From outside, everything looks fine. You're functioning. You have job, relationships, activities, achievements. The structural elements are present, but experiential elements, the actual felt sense of well-being, are absent or muted. And this pseudo-well-being is fragile. It doesn't sustain you through difficulty because it's not rooted in genuine experience. When stress increases or circumstances change, the facade cracks easily. You don't have deep resources that real well-being provides because you've been maintaining appearance without substance. Seligman's later work emphasized building these elements intentionally, practicing gratitude to increase positive emotion, seeking flow activities for engagement, investing in relationships, connecting daily actions to larger meaning, pursuing mastery in domains you care about. But all these practices require emotional authenticity. They require actually experiencing what you're experiencing, not performing okayness while feeling disconnected. You can't practice gratitude while suppressing your full emotional life. Can't achieve flow while allocating cognitive resources to monitoring. Can't build genuine relationships without emotional honesty. Can't find meaning without listening to emotional signals that tell you what matters. Can't experience accomplishment as satisfying without allowing yourself to feel both struggle and success. Pretending you're fine might create appearance of well-being, but it systematically undermines actual experience of the five elements Seligman identified as essential to human flourishing. You end up with a life that looks good from outside, but feels empty from inside, vulnerable to collapse precisely because it was never built on solid ground. There's a difference between suppression and rumination, though they might seem like opposites. Suppression is refusal to engage with emotional content. Rumination is inability to stop engaging. But they're both dysfunctional, and interestingly, they often create each other. When you suppress during the day, where does it go? Often it shows up later as rumination. Lying in bed, suddenly replaying the conversation from 3 days ago, the one you told yourself didn't bother you. Analyzing what was said, generating alternative responses, imagining future scenarios. The emotion you suppressed is now demanding attention in repetitive, unproductive thinking. Rumination feels like you're doing something. You're thinking about the problem, analyzing. But research distinguishes clearly between rumination and constructive processing. Rumination is repetitive and passive, going over same ground without reaching resolution or new understanding. It's abstract rather than concrete, thinking about what it all means about you, rather than thinking through specific actions you might take. Constructive processing is active and moves forward. You're acknowledging the emotion, identifying what triggered it, considering what you might do differently, making meaning in a way that leads to learning or closure. It has an arc. You enter with a question or distress, and exit with greater clarity or a decision, or at least a sense of having understood something. Susan Nolan Hoeksema found that people who ruminate in response to distress are significantly more likely to develop depression and to have longer, more severe depressive episodes. Rumination prolongs negative mood rather than resolving it. It amplifies distress rather than processing it. And here's the connection. Nolan Hoeksema found people often ruminate precisely because they haven't processed emotions when they arose. The suppressed content remains unresolved, so the mind keeps circling back, trying to make sense of something never fully acknowledged. There's also a quality of rumination that mirrors learned helplessness. Rumination focuses on questions that can't be answered. Why do I always mess things up? Why can't I handle things better? What's wrong with me? These are unanswerable because they're based on distorted premises. But rumination doesn't challenge premises. It accepts them and spins trying to explain the unexplainable. The alternative to both suppression and rumination is adaptive processing. This involves several elements. First, acknowledgement. Simply recognizing you're having an emotional response, naming it with specificity. I'm anxious about the presentation. I'm angry about how that conversation went. I'm sad about the friendship changing. Not dramatizing, not suppressing, just acknowledging it as a fact of your current experience. This might sound trivially simple, but for people habituated to suppression, it's not. Acknowledgement requires pausing, directing attention inward, and stating something true about your internal experience. It requires overriding the impulse to immediately say you're fine. Second, allowing. Giving the emotion some space to be present without immediately trying to change it or make it go away. Not wallowing, not catastrophizing, but also not rushing to fix or eliminate the feeling. Just letting it exist for a few moments while you observe it. Allowing is particularly difficult for people who've learned to fear their emotions, who believe that acknowledging feelings will lead to being overwhelmed. But research on emotional exposure, the deliberate practice of experiencing emotions without avoidance, shows the opposite. Emotions that are allowed to be present tend to peak and then naturally decline. It's the avoidance that maintains them. Third, curiosity. Approaching the emotion with questions rather than judgments. What is this emotion responding to? What might it be trying to tell me? What need or value is connected to this feeling? Curiosity shifts you out of the threat response that often accompanies strong emotion. It engages the problem-solving, meaning-making parts of your brain, rather than just the alarm systems. Fourth, expression, but not necessarily in the form of emotional display. Expression can be writing in a journal, talking to someone you trust, engaging in physical activity that discharges physiological arousal, creating art, any behavior that externalizes the internal experience. James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing demonstrates the power of this. In study after study, people who wrote about emotional experiences, particularly traumatic or difficult ones, showed improvements in physical health, immune function, psychological well-being, even academic and work performance. The writing didn't need to be shared with anyone. It didn't need to be eloquent. It just needed to be honest, to translate internal experience into words on a page. The mechanism appears to be that. Expression helps integrate the experience, connects the emotional response to the narrative of your life, creates coherence where there was just disconnected distress. It moves the emotion from something happening to you to something you've experienced and made sense of. Fifth, response. This doesn't mean you have to take action in response to every emotion, but adaptive processing involves at least considering whether action is warranted. Given that I'm feeling this, is there something I need to do? A conversation to have? A boundary to set? A change to make? A need to address? Sometimes the answer is yes, and the emotion has successfully communicated information that leads to adaptive behavior. Sometimes the answer is no, and the emotion is acknowledged but doesn't require external action. Either way, you've completed the loop. Sixth, reappraisal. This is the process Seligman emphasized in his work on learned optimism, taking the automatic explanation you generated and deliberately considering alternatives. Not denial, not forced positive thinking, but genuine examination of whether your first interpretation is the only or most accurate one. I'm anxious about the presentation because I'm terrible at public speaking. Might be reappraised as, I'm anxious because this presentation is important and I want to do well, which is understandable. Same emotion, different explanation, different implications for what it means about you and what you might do about it. Reappraisal doesn't eliminate emotions, but it can change their intensity and meaning. It interrupts the pessimistic explanatory style that turns normal emotional responses into evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The difference between these adaptive strategies and both suppression and rumination is striking. Suppression is refusal to engage. Rumination is stuck engagement. Adaptive processing is engaged processing that moves toward resolution. And critically, adaptive. Processing is a skill. It improves with practice. The first few times you try to acknowledge and allow an emotion instead of suppressing it, it might feel overwhelming or unfamiliar. But over time, you develop confidence that you can experience emotions without being destroyed by them. You build a repertoire of strategies for processing different kinds of emotional experiences. You learn through direct experience that emotions are navigable. But if you're always pretending you're fine, you never get this practice. You never build the skill. You remain stuck with the belief that emotions must be suppressed because you've never learned any other way to manage them. The suppression that feels protective is actually preventing you from developing the competence that would make protection unnecessary. There's a concept in psychology called psychological flexibility, and it might be one of the most important ideas for understanding mental health. It's not about being happy all the time or never experiencing difficulty. It's about being able to be present with your experience, whatever it is, and choosing behavior based on your values, rather than being controlled by avoidance of discomfort. Stephen Hayes, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, describes psychological flexibility as having several core components: the ability to be present in the moment, the ability to accept internal experiences without needing to change or eliminate them, the ability to see your thoughts as mental events rather than literal truths, the ability to maintain a sense of self that's broader than any single thought or feeling, and the ability to identify what matters to you and take action in that direction, even when it's uncomfortable. Notice that none of this involves pretending you're fine. In fact, pretending you're fine is essentially the opposite of psychological flexibility. It's rigid control. It's avoidance-driven behavior. It's the refusal to be present with difficult internal experiences. The flexibility metaphor is useful. A tree that's flexible bends in the wind without breaking. A rigid tree snaps. Human beings face psychological winds constantly: stress, loss, conflict, uncertainty, disappointment. The question isn't whether you'll face these things. The question is whether you have the flexibility to bend without breaking. And suppression, the constant effort to appear fine regardless of internal reality, is a form of rigidity. You've decided that certain internal experiences are unacceptable, that you must maintain a specific external presentation, that deviation from okayness is failure. This rigidity makes you brittle. When stress exceeds your capacity to suppress, you don't bend, you break. Hayes emphasizes acceptance as central to flexibility. But acceptance doesn't mean resignation or passive tolerance of harm. It means acknowledging what's actually present in your experience rather than fighting reality. You can accept that you're anxious about something while still taking action to address it. You can accept that you're grieving while still engaging with life. You can accept that a situation is difficult while still working to change it. The opposite of acceptance, what Hayes calls experiential avoidance, is the attempt to control or eliminate unwanted internal experiences. Suppression is a form of experiential avoidance. You're avoiding the experience of difficult emotions by refusing to acknowledge them. Research on experiential avoidance shows that it's associated with nearly every form of psychological distress: anxiety disorders, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders. All involve patterns of avoiding unwanted internal experiences. The avoidance creates short-term relief, but long-term problems. You temporarily don't have to feel the difficult feeling, but the avoidance itself becomes a source of suffering and limits your life in significant ways. Psychological flexibility involves willingness instead of avoidance. Willingness to feel what you feel, think what you think, remember what you remember, all while still moving toward what matters to you. This isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be, but it's workable in a way that avoidance isn't. Seligman's later work, particularly on resilience, converged with these ideas. He studied people who maintained well-being despite facing significant adversity. What distinguished resilient individuals wasn't the absence of difficult emotions or stress. It was the ability to acknowledge difficulty without being defined by it, to experience distress without catastrophizing, to maintain connection to meaning and purpose, even while struggling. Resilience, in Seligman's framework, isn't about toughness in the sense of not feeling things. It's about flexibility in the sense of being able to experience the full range of human emotion while still functioning, still connecting, still pursuing what matters. It's the capacity to say, "This is hard, and I'm struggling," without that becoming, "Therefore, I'm broken and hopeless." He identified several skills that build resilience. Realistic optimism, which we've discussed in terms of explanatory style. The ability to generate optimistic explanations when appropriate, while still seeing situations clearly. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider multiple perspectives and solutions rather than getting locked into one interpretation. Social connection, reaching out rather than isolating when things are difficult. And meaning, maintaining connection to purpose, even during dark times. Notice that every single one of these skills requires not pretending you're fine. Realistic optimism requires acknowledging difficulty before reframing it. Cognitive flexibility requires recognizing your automatic thoughts so you can consider alternatives. Social connection requires authenticity about your actual state. Meaning requires emotional honesty about what matters to you. Pretending you're fine is anti-resilience. It's the refusal to acknowledge difficulty, which means you can't practice any of the skills that would help you navigate it. You're trying to avoid the very experiences that, when processed adaptively, build the strength to handle future challenges. There's a particular study from Seligman's resilience research worth considering. He worked with the U.S. Army to develop resilience training for soldiers facing extraordinary stress and trauma. The training didn't teach soldiers to suppress emotions or maintain a stoic facade. It taught them to acknowledge stress reactions as normal, to identify their thoughts and challenge catastrophic interpretations, to maintain social connections, to connect their daily actions to larger meaning. The soldiers who went through this training showed better mental health outcomes, fewer symptoms of depression, and PTSD, better performance under stress. They didn't become emotionless, they became emotionally skilled. They developed flexibility where others had only rigid suppression. This has implications far beyond military contexts. If people facing combat stress benefit from acknowledgement and processing, rather than suppression, how much more true is this for the kinds of stress most people face? Work pressure, relationship conflicts, health concerns, existential questions. These warrant emotional acknowledgement, not suppression. Building psychological flexibility is a practice. It starts with small moments of willingness. Instead of immediately suppressing a difficult feeling, you pause and acknowledge it. I'm feeling anxious right now. That's it. You're not necessarily doing anything about it yet. You're just being present with what's actually true. Then maybe you practice allowing it to be there for a moment without rushing to change it. You notice where you feel it in your body, what thoughts accompany it, what the texture of the experience is. You're building familiarity with your own emotional landscape. Then maybe you get curious about values. Given that I'm anxious, what does that tell me about what matters? What would I do in this situation if I weren't controlled by the desire to avoid this feeling? And then, maybe you take action based on values rather than based on avoidance. None of this is dramatic. It's quiet, internal work. But it's the work that builds genuine resilience and flexibility. It's the practice of being present with yourself as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be. And here's what Seligman found. People who develop this kind of flexibility don't have fewer challenges. They don't live stress-free lives, but they suffer less in the face of those challenges. They maintain well-being not by avoiding difficulty, but by having the skills to navigate it. They can bend without breaking because they've practiced bending, practiced acknowledging difficulty, and processing it and continuing forward. The promise of pretending you're fine is that if you can just maintain the facade long enough, eventually you will be fine. But the research suggests the opposite. The more you practice suppression and avoidance, the more rigid you become. The less equipped you are to handle the difficulties that inevitably arise. The more brittle your psychological state. The alternative isn't to collapse into your emotions or to make emotional expression the center of your life. It's to develop the flexibility to acknowledge what's present, to make room for the full range of human experience, and to choose your actions based on what matters, rather than on what's most comfortable in the moment. That flexibility, that willingness to be present with difficulty while still engaging with life, is what resilience actually looks like. And it begins the moment you stop pretending you're fine and start acknowledging what's actually true. You wake up and your first thought isn't about what you need to do today. It's about whether you're okay. You scan internally, checking for signs of distress, assessing whether you'll be able to maintain the facade. Maybe you feel tightness in your chest, heaviness that wasn't there when you fell asleep. You tell yourself it's nothing. You get up. You move through your morning, and somewhere in those first 30 minutes, you make the decision you've made hundreds of times before. You're fine. Except you're not. And now you understand why that matters, why it costs you, why the strategy that seems protective is actually destructive. The research is clear. Suppression consumes the cognitive resources you need to think clearly and perform well. It keeps your body in a state of physiological stress that damages your health over time. It creates distance in the relationships that should sustain you. It teaches your brain that you're helpless in the face of your own emotions. It makes those emotions rebound with greater intensity later. It trains you in pessimistic thinking patterns that undermine well-being. It blocks access to the information your emotions contain. It creates the appearance of flourishing while hollowing out the actual experience. It prevents you from learning adaptive ways to process emotional experience. And it makes you rigid exactly where you need flexibility. But here's what might be most important. None of this is irreversible. The patterns you've learned through suppression can be unlearned. The skills you haven't developed can be developed now. The flexibility you've lost can be rebuilt. It won't happen all at once, and it won't be perfectly comfortable, but it's possible. It starts with one honest moment. One acknowledgement of what's actually present instead of what should be present. One instance where you let yourself feel something instead of pushing it away. One conversation where you're real instead of fine. These moments don't seem significant. They're not dramatic, but they're the practice that builds capacity. Each time you acknowledge rather than suppress, you're strengthening the neural pathways that allow emotional processing. You're gathering evidence that you can feel things without being destroyed. You're learning what your emotions are trying to tell you. You're building the flexibility that creates genuine resilience. And you're reclaiming something essential. Your emotional life isn't something to be managed into silence. It's information. It's connection to what matters. It's the texture that makes life feel lived rather than endured. When you stop pretending you're fine, you don't just stop suffering as much. You start experiencing more fully, more connection, more meaning, more presence, more of what makes life worth living. The weight you've been carrying, the weight of maintaining the facade, the weight of unprocessed emotion, the weight of believing you should be different than you are, you can set it down. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, with practice, with patience, with the recognition that you're learning skills you were never taught but can develop now. It starts with one true statement. I'm not fine right now. And the second statement, just as important, that's a normal human experience, and I can learn to navigate it. You don't have to keep pretending. The cost is too high, and you deserve better than a life spent hiding from yourself. Thank you for staying with this. If any of it resonated, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, that recognition itself is valuable. It's the first step towards something different, something more sustainable, something more true. You're not alone in learning how to stop pretending, and the path forward, though it requires practice and patience, is available to you right now. If you've been paying attention to your own reactions while listening, you might have noticed something. Maybe a tightness in your chest at certain points. Maybe recognition, the sense of seeing your own patterns described. Maybe resistance, the impulse to argue that your situation is different, that you have good reasons for suppressing, that acknowledging difficulty would actually make things worse. Those reactions are information too. This isn't about diving immediately into processing years of suppressed emotion. It's not about dramatic revelations or sudden transformations. It's about starting small with something manageable, something that feels possible right now. Here's what the research suggests actually helps. Not theory, not aspiration. Actual practices that build the capacity to stop pretending and start acknowledging. Start with body awareness. Your emotions show up in your body before they fully reach consciousness. Tension in your shoulders, tightness in your throat, heaviness in your chest, restlessness in your legs. These are early signals, easier to notice than complex emotional states. Practice checking in with your body a few times a day, not to fix anything, just to notice. My jaw is clenched, my breathing is shallow. That's information. That's the beginning of presence instead of suppression. Practice emotional labeling with specificity. Instead of, I'm stressed, try, I'm anxious about the deadline and frustrated with the unclear instructions, and disappointed that I haven't made more progress. Research on affect labeling shows that putting feelings into words actually reduces their intensity and the amygdala activity associated with emotional arousal. The more specific your labels, the better. You're training your brain to distinguish among emotional states instead of lumping everything into fine or not fine. Use expressive writing. 15 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. Write about something difficult. Don't worry about grammar or eloquence. Just get the internal experience onto the page. Pennebaker's research showed that this practice, remarkably simple, produces measurable improvements in immune function, psychological well-being, even work performance. The mechanism appears to be that writing integrates emotional experience, creates narrative coherence, reduces the cognitive load of carrying unprocessed material. Identify one person you can be honest with. Not everyone, not in every context, but one relationship where you can practice saying, "I'm struggling," instead of, "I'm fine." This doesn't mean dumping your entire emotional backlog on them. It means small moments of genuine disclosure. "That conversation was harder than I made it seem. I'm more anxious about this than I let on." You're practicing vulnerability in doses small enough to manage. Practice reappraisal using Seligman's dimensions. When you notice yourself explaining difficulty in pessimistic terms, permanent and pervasive and personal, pause. Ask yourself if there are alternative explanations, not forced optimism, just genuine consideration of whether your automatic interpretation is the only accurate one. "I always mess this up" becomes, "This particular instance was difficult." "Everything is falling apart" becomes, "These specific areas are challenging right now." "I'm fundamentally flawed" becomes, "I'm dealing with a hard situation without having practiced the skills it requires." Build tiny moments of allowing. When you notice a difficult emotion arising, instead of immediately suppressing, see if you can let it be present for 30 seconds, not dramatizing it, not acting on it, just letting it exist while you breathe. You're gathering evidence that you can tolerate discomfort, that feeling something doesn't mean being overwhelmed by it. This is exposure in the smallest possible doses, the practice that builds genuine capacity. Connect actions to values. Seligman's PERMA framework suggests that meaning comes from serving something larger than yourself, but you can't connect to meaning if you're disconnected from your emotional experience. Practice asking, "What matters to me here? What would I do in this situation if I were acting based on values, rather than based on avoiding discomfort?" Not every action needs to be value-driven, but practicing the connection reminds you that you have agency beyond just managing your emotional presentation. Notice when you're ruminating versus when you're processing. Rumination is repetitive, passive, abstract. "Why do I always? What's wrong with me that? Why can't I?" Processing is active, specific, forward-moving. "What happened? What did I feel? What might I do differently? What can I learn?" When you catch yourself ruminating, you can sometimes shift by asking a processing question. "What's one concrete thing I could do about this?" The shift from abstract to concrete often breaks the rumination loop. Practice self-compassion in the specific way Kristin Neff defines it. 3 components. Mindfulness, acknowledging what you're experiencing without suppression or exaggeration. Common humanity, recognizing that struggle is part of being human, not evidence of your unique inadequacy. And self-kindness, treating yourself with the same patience you'd offer someone you care about. This isn't self-indulgence. It's the stance that allows you to be present with difficulty without adding the layer of shame that makes everything worse. Build physical practices that discharge arousal. When you suppress emotions, the physiological activation persists. Your body is prepared for action that never comes. Movement helps complete the stress cycle, not as avoidance of processing, but as a complement to it. Walking, running, dancing, whatever allows your body to metabolize the arousal that suppression leaves stranded. You're not exercising away your feelings. You're addressing the physiological component so the cognitive processing can happen more effectively. Create transition rituals between contexts. One reason people suppress is the fear that if they acknowledge difficulty in one domain, it will bleed into everything. A transition ritual, something simple that marks the shift from work to home, or from a difficult task to rest, can help you contain processing without suppressing. 5 minutes of sitting quietly, a specific route you walk, a particular activity that signals to your brain that you're moving from one context to another. This creates permission to acknowledge difficulty in appropriate contexts without fearing it will overwhelm your entire life. These practices aren't a complete solution. They're starting points. Small ways to interrupt the pattern of suppression and begin building capacity for acknowledgement and processing. You don't need to do all of them. You might try one and discover it doesn't fit how you operate. That's information too. The key insight from all the research we've covered is this. Suppression is a skill you've practiced extensively. You're good at it because you've done it thousands of times. Acknowledgement and adaptive processing are also skills. Right now, you're less practiced at them. They feel harder, riskier, less natural, but they can be learned the same way suppression was learned, through repeated practice. Every time you choose acknowledgement over suppression, you're building new neural pathways. You're gathering evidence that contradicts the learned helplessness. You're developing the emotional granularity that makes feelings navigable. You're reducing the cognitive load that impairs your functioning. You're allowing your physiology to regulate instead of running hot constantly. You're creating the possibility of genuine connection. You're building real well-being instead of the facade version. You're developing psychological flexibility instead of brittle rigidity. And here's what Seligman's later work emphasized. This isn't just about reducing suffering, though it does that. It's about accessing the full range of human experience, including the positive emotions and engagement and relationships and meaning and accomplishment that make life rich. Suppression doesn't just block difficult feelings, it dampens everything. When you stop pretending you're fine, you don't just experience your struggles more fully, you experience your joys more fully, your connections more fully, your purpose more fully. The life on the other side of suppression isn't perfectly happy. It's more fully alive, more present, more genuine, more sustainable, less exhausting, less fragile, less lonely. You don't have to make a dramatic decision to change everything at once. You don't have to be perfect at any of these practices. You just have to start. One honest moment, one acknowledged feeling, one conversation where you don't pretend. One day where you notice what's actually present instead of performing what should be present. The research tells us why pretending you're fine makes things worse. But more than that, it tells us why acknowledging difficulty, despite feeling harder in the moment, actually makes things better. It aligns you with how your brain and body actually work instead of fighting them. It builds capacity instead of depleting it. It creates connection instead of isolation. It opens the path toward genuine well-being instead of the hollow performance version. You've been carrying this weight for a long time. The weight of maintaining the facade, the weight of unprocessed emotion, the weight of disconnection from yourself and others, the weight of believing you should be different than you are. You can set it down, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, with practice, with patience, with the recognition that you're learning skills you were never taught but can develop now. It starts with one true statement: I'm not fine right now. And the second statement, just as important, that's a normal human experience, and I can learn to navigate it. The patterns are clear now. The mechanisms are understood. The costs of suppression accumulate across every domain: cognitive, physiological, social, psychological. But the alternative is also clear. Small practices, repeated consistently, that build the capacity to acknowledge rather than suppress, to process rather than avoid, to be present with yourself as you actually are. Martin Seligman spent the first part of his career studying what makes people helpless and depressed. He spent the latter part studying what makes people resilient and flourishing. The through line is this: you can learn your way out of patterns that don't serve you. You can build skills that transform how you navigate difficulty. You can develop the flexibility that allows you to experience the full range of being human without being destroyed by it. But only if you stop pretending you're fine when you're not. Only if you're willing to acknowledge what's actually present. Only if you practice, in small ways every day, the courage to be honest with yourself about your own experience. Thank you for listening to this. If any of it resonated, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, that recognition is the first step. Not the last step, but the first. And from that first step of recognition, everything else becomes possible. The practice becomes available. The path becomes clear. The weight becomes lighter. You don't have to keep pretending, and you're not alone in learning how to stop.